What would you do if you had to choose between $1 billion deal and a lost little child? Would you walk away from a meeting of a lifetime? Or would you stop just to help a stranger who needed you most? Tonight, you'll hear the story of the CEO who shocked the world by canceling everything for one little girl. But before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop it down in the comments. I'd love to see how far this story travels. Now, let's dive in. It was supposed to be the biggest day of his life. The morning when every decision, every risk, every sacrifice would finally pay off. A deal worth billions was waiting. The boardroom was already filling with powerful men and women, their eyes fixed on one empty chair, the CEO's chair. But miles away, that very CEO was not rushing toward the meeting. He had already stopped in his tracks, because there, at the edge of a busy street, stood a little girl, no older than 7. Her hair was tangled, her cheeks streaked with tears. She clutched a small stuffed rabbit, so tightly it looked like her only friend in the world. Crowds pushed past her without slowing down. Some glanced, most didn't. To them, she was just another child crying in a city that never paused. But not to him. The CEO, the man who had built empires and crushed deadlines, who lived in a world where every second was money. For the first time in years, he hesitated. He could feel his phone buzzing in his pocket. His driver was waiting. His assistant was calling. Every voice in his world screamed, "You can't be late. Not today." And yet, something inside him whispered louder. He stepped off the curb, walked straight toward the child, and knelt down until his eyes met hers. In that moment, the $1 billion deal, the reputation, the headlines, all of it vanished, because what he saw in her eyes wasn't just fear. It was something he remembered, something he had once felt himself. And right there at the height of his career, the CEO made a choice that would shock everyone who knew him. He chose a child. Before that moment on the street, before the crying child with the stuffed rabbit, he was someone else entirely. To the world, he was Ethan Cole, a name whispered in boardrooms, a man whose signature could shift entire markets. The CEO who had turned a struggling company into a global empire. He lived in penthouses where the city lights stretched like an endless galaxy beneath his windows. His calendar was carved down to the very minute. Investors called him relentless. Employees called him untouchable. And the media, they called him the $1 billion mind. But what people didn't see was the pressure, the weight that came with it all. Every day, his phone buzzed with reminders, calls with shareholders, lunches with partners, late-night negotiations with clients in time zones he had never even visited. There was no room for error, no room for pause, because in his world, time wasn't just money, it was everything. And on this particular morning, the stakes were higher than ever. The deal waiting for him in that boardroom wasn't just another meeting. It was history in the making. A contract that could seal his legacy and cement his place among the most powerful business leaders alive. Billions of dollars, thousands of jobs, decades of reputation on the line. His assistant had reminded him at least a dozen times, "You cannot be late, Ethan. Not today. Every second matters." And he knew she was right. In fact, he had practiced every word of his opening pitch. He had memorized every clause in the contract. This was the day his empire would rise higher than ever before. But here's the part no one ever really understood about Ethan Cole. Beneath the tailored suits, beneath the sharp jawline on magazine covers, beneath the image of perfection, he was still human. And humanity, real, raw, unplanned humanity, has a way of showing up when you least expect it. That's why when he saw the little girl on the street that morning, something in him stirred. Something no $1 billion deal could silence. Because Ethan Cole wasn't just a CEO. He was a man who had once known loss. A man who remembered all too clearly what it felt like to be small, scared, and unseen. And that truth, hidden under years of power and wealth, was about to change everything. The city around him didn't slow down. Cars roared past. People hurried by. Eyes fixed on their phones, their schedules, their own endless problems. But Ethan Cole had stopped The little girl stood frozen near the curb, her tiny hands clutching that worn-out stuffed rabbit as if it were a lifeline. Her lips trembled, her eyes darted, searching to see a stranger's, yet finding no familiar face. For a moment, Ethan simply watched. The CEO in him screamed that this was not his responsibility. He had a meeting, one that couldn't wait. Someone else, surely someone else would step in. But nobody did. And that silence, that indifference to the world around her, it pulled at something deep inside him. So he walked forward, step by step, until the noise of the street faded, and all that remained was the sound of a child's uneven breaths. When he crouched down to her level, her wide, tear-filled eyes met his. And for the first time that morning, he wasn't the CEO. He was just a man, staring into the face of fear he recognized all too well. His voice, usually sharp in boardrooms, softened. "Hey, are you okay?" The little girl blinked at him, hesitant, unsure she could trust a stranger in a suit. Her lower lip quivered as she whispered, almost too softly to hear, I can't find my mom." The words pierced through him like glass. Ethan glanced around. Crowds moving too fast, cars honking, people rushing past as though a child's heartbreak didn't exist. And in that instant, something inside him shifted. The billion-dollar deal, the pressure of waiting investors, the image of headlines screaming his success, all of it faded into the background, because right there, on a busy city street, he realized something far greater than business was at stake. This wasn't just a lost child. This was a test of who he really was when no cameras were watching. And as he reached out a hand, steady and gentle, Ethan Cole, the man who once measured his life in dollars and minutes, made a silent promise that until this little girl was safe in her mother's arms again, he wasn't going anywhere. Ethan's phone buzzed again, then again. Each vibration felt heavier than the last, like the world was trying to drag him back to where it thought he belonged. His driver's voice echoed through the Bluetooth earpiece. "Sir, we're already behind schedule. The board is waiting. We have exactly 10 minutes before the contract presentation begins." He could almost see it, the polished conference table, the executives shuffling papers, the impatient stares aimed at that one empty chair. Every instinct, every part of the disciplined CEO in him screamed, "Stand up, walk away, get to the meeting." But then he looked at her, the little girl clinging to her stuffed rabbit, her cheeks damp with tears, her voice still shaking as she whispered, "What if I never find her?" And in that instant, time stopped. Ethan straightened his back, pulled the phone from his pocket, and stared at the screen lighting up with call after call. His assistant's name flashed again and again, urgent, relentless. He could already imagine the headlines if he didn't show. The investors' outrage. The empire he had built trembling. But something deeper than fear pushed through him. He pressed the phone to his ear. A familiar voice burst out. "Ethan, where are you? Everyone is waiting. This is a deal of a lifetime. You can't just disappear." There was a long pause. The kind of pause that makes a person's heart race, because you know the next words will change everything. And then, with a calmness that stunned even himself, Ethan said quietly, "Cancel it." The silence on the other end was deafening. His assistant stuttered, confused. "Cancel? Ethan, are you out of your mind? Billions are on the line." But his reply was steady, unwavering. "There will be other deals. There won't be another chance to help her." And with that, he ended the call. In the middle of a city that never slowed down, Ethan Cole, the man once defined by deadlines and dollar signs, walked away from a billion-dollar meeting, not because of profit, not because of strategy, but because, for the first time in years, he listened to his heart instead of his calendar. And though no one in that boardroom knew it yet, the decision he made that morning would echo far beyond any contract ever could. The decision was made. The meeting gone. The billion-dollar deal left behind. Now it was just a man in a suit and a child who looked too small for the weight she carried. Ethan stood, gently extending his hand. The little girl hesitated, clutching her stuffed rabbit tighter, before finally placing her tiny fingers in his. It was a fragile kind of trust, like glass, but it was trust all the same. "Let's find your mom," he said softly. And together, they stepped into the rushing tide of the city. At first, the streets felt overwhelming. Skyscrapers loomed above them, shadows stretching across the pavement, the honking of horns, the chatter of strangers, the blur of colors. It was chaos to her. She gripped Ethan's hand tighter, as though letting go meant she'd be swallowed whole. So Ethan slowed his pace. For years, he had been the man who walked too fast, who never stopped to look around, whose footsteps always echoed ahead of everyone else. But today, he matched his steps to hers. Small, cautious, steady, they stopped at every corner. He bent down, showing her faces in crowd. "Do you see her?" he asked gently. Each time, she shook her head. Her eyes grew heavier, her voice softer, her hope thinner. And yet, she began to speak. Between tears, she told him her name, her favorite ice cream flavor, how her mom braided her hair every morning before school, how the stuffed rabbit she carried was the only thing she hadn't let go of since her dad left. Ethan listened, really listened. For once, there was no phone buzzing, no contract waiting, just a child's trembling words and the responsibility of being the one person who refused to walk past. The search carried them through crowded sidewalks, across busy intersections, into quiet little shops where Ethan politely asked if anyone had seen a frantic mother looking for a child. Most people shook their heads. Some barely looked up. But every rejection only made him tighten his grip on her hand. "Don't worry," he whispered. "We'll find her." At one point, she grew tired. Her little legs, no match for the endless pace of the city. Without a second thought, Ethan bent down and lifted her into his arms. The billionaire CEO who owned fleets of cars and signed contracts worth fortunes, now carrying a lost child against his chest as though she was the only thing in the world that mattered. Her head rested on his shoulder. For the first time, her sobs quieted, and slowly, he felt her breathing steady, her small body finally relaxing in his arms. It wasn't the silence of despair. It was the silence of trust. As they moved deeper into the city, Ethan found himself glancing not just for her mother, but at the life around him he had long ignored. The laughter of children chasing pigeons in the park, the smell of roasted chestnuts from a vendor's cart, the old couple holding hands as they crossed the street, things he had passed 1,000 times but never really seen. And with every step, something inside him shifted. He wasn't just helping her find her way home. In a way, she was helping him find his, too. By the time the sun dipped lower in the sky, the search had stretched longer than either of them expected. Ethan's suit jacket was wrinkled, his tie loose, and his polished shoes scuffed from miles of pavement. And yet, for the first time in years, he didn't care, because somewhere in that sprawling city, a mother was waiting. And until he placed his child back in her arms, he wasn't stopping. Not for deals, not for deadlines, not for anything. As the city stretched endlessly before them, Ethan carried the little girl through streets that felt both familiar and haunting, because with every block they walked, memories he had buried long ago began to stir. It started with the sound of her voice, the way she whispered, "What if I never find her?" Those words echoed in his mind, colliding with a memory he wished he could forget. A younger version of himself, barely 10 years old, standing in a grocery store parking lot, clutching a paper bag with both hands. His father had told him to wait right there, that he'd be back in a minute. But that minute had turned into an hour, and that hour into forever. Ethan remembered the feeling, the confusion that turned into panic, the ache in his chest as strangers passed him by, not one stopping to ask if he was okay, and the crushing realization that the person he trusted most wasn't coming back. That night, he had been found by a store clerk, taken home to a mother who cried silently in the kitchen when she realized what had happened. Ethan never saw his father again. Now, decades later, walking through the city with this little girl in his arms, the past felt frighteningly close. He could feel her trembling against him the same way he once trembled. He could see her scanning every face in the crowd, the same way he once searched for someone who never returned. And he knew what it felt like to believe the world had forgotten you. For years, Ethan had buried that boy inside him. He built walls of glass towers and signed contracts heavy enough to drown out the silence of his childhood. He convinced himself that money, power, and success could erase the sting of abandonment, but they never did. And now, in the presence of this child, those wounds were reopening, not to break him, but to remind him of something he had nearly forgotten: what it meant to be human, what it meant to choose compassion, even when the world told you to look away. The little girl stirred in his arms, her eyes half closed, her voice a whisper. "Do you think she's looking for me?" Ethan's throat tightened. He swallowed hard, steadying his voice. "Yes," he said softly. "Your mom is looking for you, and we're going to find her." But as the words left his mouth, he felt the weight of his own truth pressing down. Nobody had come back for him. Nobody had searched. And maybe that's why he couldn't let the same thing happen to her. The city lights flickered on one by one as day bled into evening. To most, it was just another night. But for Ethan Cole, it was something far more. It was a night when the boy who had once been left behind finally stepped forward. The night when the scars he carried became the very reason he refused to let go of this child's hand. Because helping her wasn't just about kindness. It was redemption. It was healing. And in finding her mother, maybe in some quiet way, he was finally finding a part of himself too. The city was beginning to change. Shadows stretched long across the sidewalks. Streetlights flickered awake, casting halos of gold on the pavement. For most people, it was the hour of heading home, of dinners waiting, of lights turned on in cozy apartments. But for Ethan and the little girl, home still felt impossibly far away. They had retraced every step she remembered: the park bench where she thought she had last seen her mother, the bakery where they had stopped earlier that morning, the crowded crosswalk where the sea of strangers had swallowed them both. Each time, nothing, no familiar face, no mother rushing forward with open arms. And with every failed attempt, the child's hope seemed to shrink a little more. Her small voice grew quieter. Her stuffed rabbit, now smudged with dirt, hung limply from her hands. Ethan tried to stay strong. He asked shopkeepers, described her mother's clothes, searched every corner with a gaze sharp enough to cut glass. But the truth was settling in like a weight on his chest. Time was slipping away. What if he couldn't find her? What if her mother was lost in another part of the city entirely? What if he'd made the wrong choice, abandoning his empire for a search that might never end? His phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up with dozens of missed calls. Messages piling in. "Where are you? You've lost everything. What were you thinking?" For the first time that day, doubt crept in. Had he traded a future for a promise he couldn't keep? He looked down at the little girl walking beside him, her small hand wrapped tightly around his. Her eyes were tired, but they still searched every passing face with a flicker of desperate hope. And that was enough to silence the doubt. Because while his investors might never forgive him, this child would never forget him. But the city didn't make it easy. The streets grew louder as the night deepened. The crowds thicker, voices overlapping, traffic snarling, the neon lights buzzing like 100 distractions. More than once, Ethan had to lift her into his arms to keep from losing her in the crush of strangers. Her head rested against his shoulder, her breathing uneven, and each time he felt her body tremble, he held her tighter. It wasn't just her fear he was carrying now. It was his own. At one point, they stopped in front of a police station. Ethan considered it. Walking inside, handed her over, letting professionals take over the search. It would have been the logical choice, the easy choice. But when he looked into her wide, pleading eyes, he knew she didn't want a stranger. She wanted him, the man who hadn't walked past, the man who stayed. So he shook his head, crouched down, and whispered, "I promised we'd find her, and I don't break promises." Her tiny nod, the way she held his hand even tighter, that was enough to keep him moving forward. Hours had slipped by. His shoes ached, his throat was dry. His perfectly pressed suit now looked like it belonged to another man. And still, he searched. Because in his heart, the fear of failing her was far greater than the fear of losing everything else. And though exhaustion threatened to drag him down, a single thought kept him going. Somewhere in this city, a mother was crying just as hard as her child. And nothing, not even the ruins of his empire, would stop him from bringing them back together. The city was alive with its usual rhythm. Neon signs glowing, street vendors calling out, laughter spilling from cafes. But for Ethan and the little girl, the world had narrowed into one fragile hope. Her steps were slower now, her eyes heavy from tears. She clutched his hand tighter than ever, as though afraid that if she let go, she'd vanish completely. And then it happened. A voice, faint at first, but sharp enough to cut through the noise of the city. Lily, the little girl, froze. Her head snapped up, eyes widening in disbelief. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then she whispered, almost breathless, "Mom." And before Ethan could say another word, she broke free from his hand. The stuffed rabbit tumbled to the ground as her small legs carried her forward. Faster, faster, until she was running straight into the arms of a woman stumbling through the crowd, her face streaked with tears, her voice breaking with relief. "Lily! Oh my God, Lily!" The mother dropped to her knees, clutching her daughter so tightly it seemed she'd never let go again. Sobs of joy and heartbreak tangled together, filling the night with something raw and pure. Ethan stood a few steps back, his chest rising and falling as though he himself had been holding his breath this entire time. The sight before him, it wasn't just a reunion. It was the ending he had prayed for without even realizing it. He watched as the little girl buried her face into her mother's shoulder, her cries melting into laughter. The woman kissed her hair again and again, whispering apologies, whispering gratitude, whispering promises to never lose her again. And Ethan simply smiled. Not the polished smile of a CEO sealing a deal, but the quiet smile of a man who knew he had done the only thing that mattered. The mother's eyes finally lifted, finding him in the crowd. She mouthed two words, simple but heavy with meaning. "Thank you." Ethan nodded once, softly, and bent down to pick up the stuffed rabbit from the pavement. He brushed it off gently before handing it back to the little girl. She reached for it with a grin so wide, so bright, it nearly undid him. And then he stepped back. The moment belonged to them, not to him. It always had. For the first time in years, Ethan felt the weight on his shoulders lift, not because he had saved a deal or built an empire, but because he had reunited a child with her mother. And as he turned to leave, fading into the crowd, he realized sometimes the greatest victories don't happen in boardrooms. They happen on street corners, in the arms of family, in the quiet, unspoken triumph of choosing what's right over what's profitable. By morning, the story had spread farther than Ethan Cole ever imagined. It began as whispers in the city. A CEO seen walking the streets with a lost child, abandoning a boardroom filled with billion-dollar contracts. Then came the headlines. The meeting that never happened. Billionaire CEO walks away for a child. Some praise him as a hero. Others called him reckless. In living rooms across the country, families nodded in quiet admiration. Parents wiped away tears, whispering, "That's what I'd want someone to do for my child." Strangers online flooded comment sections with messages of gratitude, calling it a rare glimpse of humanity in a world too often obsessed with money. But behind the polished glass of corporate towers, the reaction was colder. Investors raged. How could he throw it all away? Shareholders fumed over the millions, perhaps billions, lost in those few hours of absence. Some even demanded his resignation, convinced that kindness had no place in leadership. And yet, when reporters pressed microphones to his lips, Ethan didn't flinch. He didn't spin the story, didn't try to defend the lost deal. He simply said, "Money can be made again. A child only has one mother." Those words ignited a firestorm. To some, it was proof of a leader with values greater than profit. To others, it was the careless philosophy of a man too emotional to run an empire. But Ethan didn't care which side they fell on, because deep down he knew the truth, that the little girl's laughter, the way she clung to her mother's neck, was worth more than every signature waiting on that contract. And for the first time in years, he felt free, not defined by stock prices, not weighed down by deadlines, but defined by a choice that reminded the world and himself what truly matters. Long after the headlines faded, long after the noise of praise and criticism quieted. Ethan Cole sat alone in his office, gazing out at the city skyline. The billion-dollar deal he had walked away from? Gone. Another company had signed it, sealing their triumph with champagne and applause. But Ethan didn't feel regret, not even for a moment, because he had gained something no contract could ever buy. He thought back to the little girl's face, the way her tears had turned into a shy smile when she saw her mother again. He remembered the way she whispered, "Thank you, mister," before disappearing into the crowd. That single moment replayed in his mind like the sweetest melody. It reminded him of his own childhood, of the boy who once longed for someone to care enough to stay. And he realized the real deal wasn't signed in a boardroom. It was sealed in that instant of human connection. For years, Ethan had been taught that success was measured in numbers, stock prices, profits, the size of a contract. But now he knew the truth. Success is measured in the lives you touch, in the moments where you choose compassion over convenience, in the courage it takes to pause, even when the world screams at you to keep going. That night, Ethan drafted a new kind of vision for his company, not one that chased money at all costs, but one that remembered the cost of forgetting our humanity. He knew some would call him foolish. He knew shareholders might walk away. But he also knew this. If leadership meant losing your humanity, it was never leadership at all. And so, the CEO who canceled a billion-dollar meeting walked into a new chapter of his life, not as the man who lost the deal, but as the man who reminded the world that sometimes the greatest victories don't make the news. Sometimes they're found in the quiet embrace between a mother and child. Sometimes they live in the moments no one was supposed to notice. And so, in the end, this story wasn't about wealth or power or even the deal that was lost. It was about something far greater, choosing humanity when the world least expects it. If this story touched you, remember, sometimes the smallest choices carry the greatest meaning. Thank you for spending this time with me. And if you'd like to hear more stories that move the heart and open the soul, make sure to subscribe to Heartfelt Tales TV. Because here, every story has the power to stay with you long after it ends. Until next time, take care and keep your heart open to the moments that truly matter.